Hey bananas, we think you're groovy. Hey bananas, we want your movie. Yeah. Driving tune buggies everywhere, just going crazy without a care. How are you today, everybody out there? It's Plastic EP from Melbourne, Australia, and coming from the UK is Chaz Newby. How are you, Chaz?
Plastic, I'm fine. How are you?
Fantastic. Now, Chaz, you got a story to tell. You're 19 years old, right? It's December 1960, and what happens?
I'm on vacation from college, right? I'm back in Liverpool. I got a call from Pete Best to get down to the Casbah Club. So I get down there, and of course, the guys are back from Germany, and there's four of them. Stuart has stayed in Hamburg with Astrid, and Pete has obviously organised it before, and he says to these guys, John, Paul, George, he'll do it. I'll do what, right? So they find me. I don't even own a bass guitar at the time, right? So they find me a bass guitar, borrow it from a good friend of mine, leather jacket, and from memory, we had about half an hour just going through the songs that they played, the songs that I used to play with Pete when we were in the Blackjacks band. It was all the classic rock and roll from the middle of the 1950s, Chuck Berry, Elvis, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, all that stuff. And so then on, I think, the 17th of December, we played at the Casbah Club. Right. Now, the Casbah Club was underneath the house. It was the cellars, a large detached house in West Derby in Liverpool. Everybody knew who we were because they'd seen us before play a different. Pete and I had played in a band called Blackjacks. Obviously, John, Paul, George had played in a band called the Quarrymen, and now they are called the Beatles, right? So that everybody's, what's going on here? We know these guys. And Neil Aspinall had put up a poster on the outside, direct from Hamburg, the fabulous Beatles. And the punters who are this is a private members club, right? So the punters, what's this direct from Hamburg crap? We know these guys. But of course, when it started, then they knew, because these blokes, these are the four guys, Pete, John, Paul, George, with Stuart. They, in parentheses, they'd done their 10,000 hours. They could play. And it was so tight, it was just knockout. So that completely floored those people. Then we did a gig in a ballroom on the other side of the river. I don't remember too much about it, except George told me, he said, if you see any trouble start on the floor, because it's on a stage, it's above, pick your amp up and let's get out quick. Right, fine. But nothing happened. But the third gig, that was the one at Litherland Town Hall. Now, I don't know what it was like in Australia in the late 50s, early 60s, but all the guys, all the classic rock and rollers disappeared, right? Elvis was in the army. Jerry Lee Lewis was in disgrace for marrying his 13-year-old cousin. Buddy Holly had died. Little Richard, he was back in the church preaching. Chuck Berry was in jail. So all these guys had disappeared, and in their place, the American recording industry had replaced them with super clean, preppy boys, suits, ties, shiny shoes, rubber ball come bouncing back to me, crap, dreadful. And that had spread across the Atlantic into Liverpool. So a lot of the bands in Liverpool were imitating those sort of people from the UK. I mean, no disrespect, but people like Cliff Richard, Marty Wilde, the Larry Parnes stable of people. And it was very nice and quiet and controlled. As I say, very dressy. And the guys in the band used to do little dances on the stage, little mincing about. Not the Beatles, no way. So the guy who introduced them, the guy who got them the gig in the first place, what was his name? Who's the?
Was it Sam Leach?
No, it wasn't Sam Leach. It was Brian Kelly who was organising the gig. Who was the guy who was the? Oh my word! He was the DJ at the Cavern. Bob Wooler, right?
Yeah,
so
that's
Bob
it.
Wooler. This is a proper dance floor, right? Sprung floor, stage, curtains. 2 bands have already been on, and the Beatles were sort of shoved in the interval. So Bob Wooler's on the stage. Paul, he stood next to Paul, on the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is for your, he was like a music hall announcer sort of thing. Direct from Hamburg, the fantastic. And he's just about, he got the Beatles out, and Paul shoved him away and screamed into Long Tall Sally. Well, of course, the audience had never seen anything like this. They'd forgotten all about the classic guys. They'd just come to dance. They weren't interested in the bands. The bands were only there to provide the music. And they've got these 5 guys on the stage jumping around. They're not wearing suits and shiny shoes. They're wearing black leather and cowboy boots and kicking the amplifiers. And it's like a beginning of punk rock. And they just stopped dancing. And then they started moving towards the stage to watch this performance. Right? They weren't interested in dancing to the music anymore. They wanted to watch these 5 guys on the stage giving it some stick. And of course, once Paul and John had got them in the palm of their hands, they just went banana. It's just like Hamburg, I guess. I mean, I was never in Hamburg, but from what I've read, that was the sort of excitement they created. Right? So we were only on for half an hour. We were just shoveled into the interval. And we finished up with Ray Charles' song, What Did I Say? Well, in the middle of that, there's a sort of shouting and response thing from the audience. So Paul's on the microphone, wow! And the audience go, wow! And, wow! Ooh! And they're just imitating. Well, they just went bananas. The guy, Brian Kelly, thought a fight had broken out. So he sends all his heavy mob into the auditorium to separate everybody. And they're just enjoying themselves, singing What Did I Say? It's brilliant. And when the Beatles came back from Germany that Christmas, they didn't have any gigs and they didn't have a bass player. Right? So this was my 3 out of 4 gigs at Liverpool. And immediately after they came off the stage, Brian Kelly got us all in his office and he booked them for the next 30 odd gigs, the next 15 or so weeks, two gigs a week. And I think the best quotation is Mark Lewison, because he said in his book about the Beatles live gigs, he said something like, from then on, they went through ups and downs and whatever, but they never looked back. And they certainly didn't, because from then on, they began to develop their reputation first in Liverpool, then further afield in the UK, then in Europe, and then 64 they were in Oz, weren't they?
That's right. And guess what? Tonight on Channel 9, that's a local TV station, they got a special showing of the 1964 concert that's been remastered. It's about to start, let's say, in an hour's time or something, and that's happening tonight.
That's the one that Jimmy Nichol played drums.
That's the one in Melbourne. Actually, Ringo played. Ringo took over.
Right, okay. Jimmy played in Adelaide then.
That's
Jimmy
right.
played the first gig in Oz. Jimmy played, and then Ringo flew in from the UK. Yeah.
Chaz, can I say, have you been in contact with Jimmy Nichol at all, or do you know where he is?
No, the only contact I've had is with the story with Jim Birkenstadt, because I wrote the
Yeah, that's
foreword
right.
to Jim's book, and so as far as that's the one, yeah.
A great book too.
It's brilliant. But
I know, I read it. It's a great book. And Jim, I've interviewed Jim. So people need to buy this book to know about Jimmy Nichol. So can you tell me a little bit about Jimmy Nichol?
Well, the only thing I know is what's in the book. That he was a professional drummer. And when George Martin and Brian Epstein are faced with this particular problem, that Ringo suddenly rushed into hospital a day before they're supposed to fly out. And George Martin just, we'll have to get a session drummer. And they just happened to find Jimmy. I think it was just as much a surprise to him as it was to everybody else. But as I understand it, he was the same size as Ringo as well, the same sort of stature. So he fitted the suit. So
he was a bit taller, I think. He's a bit taller.
Perhaps the trousers were a bit short on his legs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Now, Chaz, exactly. But Chaz, tell me, you know the Beatles story yourself. At any point, did the Beatles say, Chaz, we want you to join the band?
No, it was a bit of a confusion, I think. Bear in mind, John Lennon, his influence, his strongest friend, Stuart, the painter, he is still in Hamburg. John would never do anything to undermine Stuart. He even argued with Paul about Stuart. My impression is now, John wanted to get other Liverpool bands to join them in Hamburg, and he was acting as a sort of evangelist, that this is where you need to be, this is where it's all happening. Because bear in mind, Liverpool wasn't the centre of rock and roll in 1959-60. That was down in London. All the recording, all the music publishing, that was all down in London. And so, certainly in the beginning, there was no recording studios in Liverpool. There was no music publishing in Liverpool. There may have been one or two famous people that had come from Liverpool, but they'd had to move down to London to do it. I think John could, in a way, he was a bit of a visionary. He could see, both him and later on Brian Epstein could see where they were going. They could see the pathway, if you like. And I think John wanted other people to get on board, give him a bit of a rest. So, they were doing 10 hours a day, But I had no ambition to be a professional musician. I was at the end of my first year at college. In fact, I just started my second year. And I was in the very fortunate position. I was being paid by a company to go to college. I was employed. I mean, I had a dream ticket, and there was no way I was going to give it up. So, and as I say, that was not my objective at all. I've been in conversations before with sort of telling people that all the people I knew in Liverpool at that time that were involved in the Casbah Club, the girls as well as the guys, we were all the first real generation after the end of the Second World War. So we got all the benefits. We got the good health service, we got the good education. And so everybody had objectives of where they were going, whether they were, they wanted to do an apprenticeship and start their own business, or whether they wanted to study law or medicine at university or engineering, or we even had one guy who wanted to be a journalist. And he used to wear, this is 1959 in Liverpool, he used to wear a straw boater with a little ticket on the top with press written on it, like the guys in the 30s films in the States, And, and there were people had different objectives. People wanted to work in medical services, or they wanted to be lawyers or doctors or whatever, engineers. And people achieved their objectives. We were probably the first generation that did. We said, this is what we're going to do. John, Paul, and George wanted to be musos. They could see their future as musicians. I mean, they were just, even then, they were just so talented. It was just I can remember going back to college in January the 4th, I was back at my desk. And guys saying, well, what did you do over the holiday? One guy had been skiing in Switzerland, had a nice winter suntan. One guy had been up to Scotland to see his grandparents and whatever. And he said to me, well, what did you do? And I said, well, I played bass with a rock and roll band. I said, and you'll hear about them soon. Well, it took another 18 months before they were known, outside Liverpool. But from there, it's just, the world was their oyster. And your comment about the Jimmy Nichol tour, I mean, I was aware that, they'd started, they were in France. They'd been to the US, I think, the first time, beginning of '64. Then they were in Paris. And the next thing that was happening, they were doing a couple of gigs in Europe, Copenhagen or Amsterdam. And then they were flying out to Oz. And I mean, I just followed their career. It was just an exciting time to grow up, So,
exactly. Chaz, I've got to ask you a question. I've got Steve Elliott on the text and he's asking, did Chaz ever meet Brian Epstein? Did you ever meet Brian Epstein?
No, I was back at university. I was back at college in January '61, and the guys met Brian Epstein towards the end of 1961. I think it was the end of that year when he certainly took over their management. So I never met those guys. After January '61, I was just normal Joe Public. I wasn't a rock star anymore.
Chaz, I'm just saying, you've obviously kept your relationship with Pete Best, yeah?
Yes, of course. Well, I was at school with Pete.
So what I'm saying is, when they said goodbye to Pete, you obviously knew what was going on, or you didn't know what was going on?
I didn't know what was going on.
Okay.
No. Bear in mind, you see, from the time I sort of stepped away from it, we're talking now another 18 months, sort of the autumn of 1962. And I'd not seen Pete. They'd been working their butts off for 18 months. They'd been down 2 or 3 times to London. As I said, they had to go down to London to make the recordings. And Brian Epstein spent an awful lot of his time actually canvassing the various companies and recording people and A&R people in London, wasn't in Liverpool. So I sort of lost touch with him. And then I didn't see him again until it would be about the middle, say 65, 66. And after he was in the Beatles, then he started his own band and he'd done quite a lot of, I'm sure he was exhausted, but he just did quite a lot of touring and whatever. And then he gave it a miss. And I turned up for pre-season training at the rugby club. And the skipper comes along and says, your mate's back here. And he was sat next to me and I didn't recognize him because he'd lost so much weight. But then, we just took off again and we were playing in the same team for a couple of years. And then my wife and I came down to live here. So.
Did you cross paths with John and Paul or George after?
No.
Only
George.
Never.
Sorry, I met George one night. It would be just about as they were getting national fame, because it was the end of 1962. Because I'd just bought myself. I remember I'd just bought myself a rocket ship motorbike, and I was on my way home from my girlfriend's, who later became my wife, and I stopped the traffic light, and there was George stood at the junction, with his guitar box. So I said, "Well, George, are you going? Do you want a lift?" He said, "No, no, it's no problem." He said his brother was coming to pick him up, and so that was the last I saw of them. I've seen a few of the others, but much later. I met Billy J. Kramer in Chicago, and Joey Molland, who played in Badfinger, who recorded with Apple, didn't he? Met him there, and I've seen a couple of the Liverpool guys in concert. Since playing with the Quarrymen, I've seen a couple of the other guys who were about at that time. No,
what about the female singers? Cilla Black. Were you good friends with Cilla Black?
Never knew Cilla.
Okay.
As I say, that part of their history was after I stepped back. Anything after New Year '61, I wasn't involved at all. I was busy elsewhere, really. But it's nice to think back, and it's nice that people now that if you like, the basic facts of the Beatles have been nailed down, and all the rubbish that was written in the '60s has been rectified and whatever. People now are more interested, as you are, in the social history, the effect that this had on the future coming up, sort of thing. And I've just been amazed because people seem to think that my very, very peripheral input was of some importance. But we were just boys having fun. It was amazing.
Yeah, but that's what happened, Chaz. You got to understand, you're part of Beatle history, okay? You're very important. And David Bedford is this kind of person. He even said himself, if somebody even played drums with the Beatles for one night, I go and I find them and they're part of Beatles history. And you are part of Beatle history, whether you know it or not, you are. Because you're there. You're actually, if you want to know the truth, you're at a point where anything could have happened. Okay?
Yes.
Like, for example, Stuart was in Germany. Stuart could have turned around and said, I'm not coming back, I'm staying here, whatever he wanted to do, right? We know the story. But they could have turned around and said, we need you, Chaz. You don't know. Fate can go any way.
Absolutely. And it's very, you've hit the nail on the head. It depends on that particular moment in time and what I was doing and what everybody else was doing. But as I say, bear in mind, at the end of 1960, there were no recording studios in Liverpool. There were no music publishing. There were nobody making records. And when I look back, I think there were many reasons why the Beatles had such a big influence on the following years. They were just enormously talented. Just oozed out of them. They were very fortunate to sort of come to their pinnacle, if you like, at the time they did, because the opposition had disappeared. Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't banging. Well, he did come back briefly, but he wasn't. Chuck Berry wasn't playing. Elvis wasn't making records. Buddy Holly had died, and they stepped into that gap that had been artificially created by the recording people in the United States. And of course, they met the two most influential people, Epstein and George Martin. And so all those things together, I think, just created something which was just magic. It was amazing. And as you say, to be ever such a peripheral part of it was quite satisfying. But nevertheless, I'm still surprised that, I know why people are interested. You've explained it. I'm just still a bit surprised by it. Because nobody knew.
I know, but Chaz, let me say, okay, as I said, you're part of the Beatle history, but even you've got to understand, people that are living these times, they don't know. No one knows. No one knew.
Sure.
It's only now that we know. So we look back on the Beatles and we say, right, I've known about you. right, at high school. I've known about you.
Yeah.
Who's this guy? Chas Newby. I see the picture of you in the lounge room with the bass, and I go,
Yeah,
this is great. Same
yeah,
like Jimmy Nichol. This
yeah,
is great
absolutely.
because it's not the Beatles story. And the problem with the Beatles story is there's a lot of folklore. All right, there's a lot of
Absolutely.
stories,
Yeah,
and you can't tell the difference between anybody. And you can verify this, Chas. Before we did the interview, did I say you tell the story the way you know the story, Chas? It's got nothing to do with the books. Tell
no,
it as you were there and you know it, and no one can
absolutely,
take that away from you because only
absolutely.
you know.
Yeah, I think the that's the bit that, if you like, gives me some sense of self. The fact that I was there and I experienced it. Only a very, very small part of it. But the biggest lesson I learned was Mark Lewison when he was writing his book. And we were on the phone a couple of times, after this is the mid 1980s, right? When Mark does his first book about the Beatles live shows, right? And he says, "Is there anything else you want to say?" And I said, "Well, I think such a thing happened or this happened." "I don't think so." He said, because of course he'd attacked the problem rather than an emotional exercise of which girls were sleeping with which Beatle, all that sort of nonsense. He'd actually gone to the prime sources, the newspapers, the adverts, the posters that advertised who was playing tonight. And it was just incredible. And he said, the problem is now that I'm interviewing you 25 years after the event. And he said, when you think about what happened, you'll know certain things happened and you'll know where they happened or who was there or what part of the year it was or who said what. He said, but you won't get it all right because our memory plays, our memory rearranges, it stores things like a computer, so, and very often you look back and you think, oh yeah, but it didn't. Some things did, some places did, some times did, some guys sang, did, but very often you can't get it 100%, which is why I admire guys like yourself who are putting the history into some sort of order. Yeah, and as I say, I'm constantly surprised how much the emphasis has changed from these four guys who changed the world to what was happening to everybody else at the same time. How did we feel? What was happening in the world out? So think about when the Beatles were at the top of their performing thing together, the end of the 60s, and things rubbish like Vietnam was going on. Yeah. I can remember the day President Kennedy was assassinated, and I was traveling to St. Helens in a friend's car, and on the radio we found out that Ringo had done something, and then we found out that President Kennedy had been shot. It was totally amazing time to live. I mean, we were the blessed generation, definitely. We had all the benefits, and we were the first ones to use them. The generation, the original generation of teenagers. Can you believe it? Teenagers. Oh, hello.
I can believe it. And you know what I like? It's simplistic times. It's not
Absolutely.
complicated. It's like just a great time, no problem, no cares in the world, carefree. That doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely. Well, it's like 1962. George Harrison is just starting on his recording career as one of the 2, 3 best guitar players in the UK, and he's standing by a bus stop with his guitar box. That's how we used to travel. We used to get the bus. Imagine carting a bass amplifier on a bus. Just amazing.
Well, his dad was a bus driver. His dad was a bus driver.
That's right. George's dad was a bus driver. That's right. It's amazing.
Anyway, I got to say, Chas,
Yeah.
You go back.
So when I go back to Liverpool now and talk to Peter, we go back to the Casbah Club because that's where it's all started. There's a new museum in Liverpool now called the Magical History Museum, which is run by Peter Rogue and whatever. And we've got bits and pieces in there, so no, I just learned. I was talking to a guy last year, and my current partner, Edwin, and we went up to Liverpool for Beatles Week, not to perform, just to experience it. We go to this nice hotel on the river, and we decided we'd do the Magical Mystery Tour. So we booked our tickets, and we go to the office, pick the tickets up, go next to the bus to get on, and this guy's got a list. Now, I found out later, this guy's fluent Spanish. So they tend to put all the Spanish tourists on his bus. I don't know how we got on, but anyway. So he's looking down his list, you see, and he's got Edwin and Neil. Oh, yes, you can come on, dear. And he said to me, Chas Newby. He said, are you the Chas Newby? I said, well, yeah, I suppose so. Never occurred to me that he might know who I was. But so we got chatted, and he introduced me to these Spanish people on the bus. Amazing. But no, I love it. I love it. It's like I'm having a completely different retirement to the one that I imagined. So rather than just dropping out in the countryside here, I'm actually going around the world with the Quarrymen playing bass, which is lovely.
That's fantastic. Lovely. Let me tell you, Chas, when you look back, okay, we know now what happened after you left.
Right.
But what it must have been like to have been on stage with John and Paul next door to you on the stage and the crowd. How can you not relive that in your mind that you were there?
Every day. Pete and I know Pete and Mark Lewis when in the mid 80s when they were writing their first books, right? And these are the first factual books rather than show business books. And Pete said to me, well, what do you remember? And I remember, what do I say? I remember the opening, the Long Tall Sally with Paul screaming at the audience. I remember my feet were so sore after half an hour of stamping on the floor and kicking the amplifier. And that's what I remember. And Paul singing the Elvis number in German. Wooden Heart. And he was sort of flashing his eyes at the girls, and they were wetting themselves. And there's singing in German. How to get away from that? Brilliant. Just knockout. So talented. And it's nice at this time of my life. I'll tell you a funny story. Just before Christmas, the Quarrymen were playing in Mexico City, right? And so we're waiting to go on, and there's this little girl. She must have been about 12, and she's on the stage, and she's announcing to the audience that the next band to come on are the Quarrymen. And Rod Davis, who sings us, he's fluent Spanish, but the rest of us can only pick up odd words. And so we got words like Quarrymen, before the Beatles. So the audience are all wound up, and they're expecting this band of 4 people in funny suits and Cuban heel boots, and instead of which there's 80-year-olds wandering onto the stage. It's quite funny. But of course, they know all the words. So you don't even have to perform. We always do one Beatles song at the end of each set. And it's usually Len Gary who sings In My Life as a tribute to his friend John. but I had to do it in Mexican. So I explained, this is the best song the Beatles, as the Beatles wrote together. And I explained, that John wrote most of it and Paul did the middle eight. George did the intro. George Martin played the piano half speed while they were at lunch and then wound it up so it sounds like a harpsichord. And then we sang it. Well, the whole audience sang. There must have been, I don't know, 1,000 people. And they're all Spanish-speaking Mexicans. And they're all singing In My Life in English. It's just amazing. I mean, how can you have an effect like that? Just brilliant. And it's happening to me. So I'm really grateful.
Chaz, I'm going to ask you, here we are in 2020, and I've got to say, you chose your right career path.
Oh, absolutely.
You had an amazing life.
Absolutely.
You were there. You got no regrets.
None whatsoever.
And you know what?
And I'm getting the benefits now.
Exactly. And you know what? You deserve them. That's the thing. You deserve them.
Right. I have no issues in life at all. I've had a thoroughly enjoyable, productive existence, and I'm finishing like I started, guitar in hand. And
isn't it funny how life comes full circle?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's like when we're talking now. One of the people who, if you like, pushed me a little bit further towards the periphery of the music was Jim Birkenstadt with his book on Jimmy, and now we're forward by bass player Chaz Newby, and now we're talking about Jimmy Nichol, and he's on the stage. He's on your television tonight. So
no, it's actually, as I said, he was here. There was 5 of them, and Ringo's the one that played at Festival Hall in West Melbourne.
Right.
I was 6 years old at the time, so you got to understand. When I saw it, when they arrived here in Melbourne, they came in Essendon Airport, and they arrived in Melbourne, and there were lines of people for them to come. And when they stood there on Russell Street near Lonsdale Street from their hotel, the Southern Cross balcony, when they all came out, the 5 of them, the biggest worry was that all the people pressed up against the glass. There was all this glass in the foyer of the hotel, and it wasn't safety glass, and they were scared that people were going to die because there was that much pressure on the glass that they were worried people were going to die. That's inside outside the foyer of the Southern Cross Hotel.
Well, I guess the Beatles must have, at that particular time, between sort of 64 and 66, they must have experienced that everywhere they went, and it's difficult to. I've seen Ringo commenting on television, saying, "Well, we didn't ask for it. We were told not to go near the windows, so it excites them. We were told to stay away." And so I guess it was it wasn't all roses, that's for sure. And I think in San Francisco, I think George just suffered because he couldn't hear what he was playing, and that's enough. I've had enough. That's when they retired to Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was
exactly.
Brilliant.
And then the Monkees stepped in. They took that teeny bop of void that was open when they went from mop tops to mustaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And good on them. That's how the Beatles got started. The classic guys had disappeared, so they shoved in the gap. And I guess, the Beatles opened the door for lots of bands. The Monkees, but certainly the bands in this country. The Rolling Stones were a blues band, and George told the guy at Decca, go and sign them, because the guy at Decca had refused to sign the Beatles, but George told him to go and sign the Rolling Stones. And of course, after that, then there was the Kinks and the Who, and the bands from Liverpool like Jerry. And, brilliant. But they opened a lot of doors for a lot of people.
Chaz, it's amazing. I just want to say, before we wrap it up, you know, people are going to read, people are going to come back, and people are going to look at this video today that we had to get this conversation in generations to come, and they're going to remember Chaz Newby. Believe me.
Good. Well, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chaz.
Thank you, man. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and it's a technological wonder that we can sit here looking at each other, and we're halfway up the other side of the world. You know, brilliant. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chaz.